generational leap is an interesting time for an established game series. Game designs often come from a compromise between vision and limitations, be it financial, time, or technically, with limitations often shaping up gameplay in a way that hadn't been considered before arriving there. Bringing something that's been established on one form of hardware to another can create interesting scenarios, where you want to keep the intent intact while increasing the scope, when often the intent of the series was shaped by what was possible, which is a scope that no longer applies. It's why some game series end up reimagined from the ground up to create something that plays and looks like something new, but immediately feels familiar. Deception, despite not having the reputation for it, pushed boundaries for its generation in terms of customization and freedom in ways that was pretty unique for the time. With the new technology and a new focus for the fourth title in the series, they chose to avoid their old branding. In Japan, this game is known as Kagero 2, billed as a direct sequel to the second Deception game. In the West, it was branded as a new IP entirely. So let's see how well it does as its own thing, as well as in relation to past games in this review for Trapt. Trapt follows Allura. A princess framed for the murder of her father, the king. She finds herself trapped in an old mansion where she's given the power to control traps through a demonic hand. In the meantime, multiple schemes for the throne, control of the country, and the resurrection of an ancient evil start playing out. The story ends up playing out like a mixture of all three previous games, with most of the base setup feeling like the first and second game, presented with a similar format to the third game, cutscene recap loading screens and all. I honestly don't have much to say about the plot, because as much as the game puts effort towards distancing itself from the previous titles in its branding, this really feels like a by-the-numbers rethread of the past stories. The story feels like an excuse plot built around the game just for the sake of it, written after they decided to make a game and featuring things that should feel familiar to Deception fans. Not a narrative of its own. The biggest downfall in the story has to be the way that a lot of the tone and theming has kind of been lost in the shuffle. While past Deception games would do a good job of making you feel bad for what you were doing, often making you the villain in an innocent person revenge story after you murdered someone that they cared about, Trapt attempts this at times, but it ends up falling flat. One of the largest reasons for this is because they wanted to have it both ways. Opponents are always hostile and generally presented as evil. There are stages where random mooks are outright evil in their attempt at your life, and there's very little reason for it. A few random enemies during stages will make minor references to their desire to rape Allura, or just sadistically desire her because she's a princess, and it feels really weird. Allura's presentation as having fallen from grace doesn't really factor into her character, the motivations of her opposition, or the way that most enemies face her, so it doesn't really fit how everything plays out. Even with how crude the first game was, or what a mess the translation for the third game was, they all handled this a lot better. Allura herself doesn't really seem to have any resolve or will to do much of anything, and kinda just gets strung along through the game with even less of a presence than Millennia. But at least we have a visual kei Richter Belmont voiced by Nobuyuki Hiyama, so that's a bonus. There's still more issues with the story, but we'll get to that, as it ties into some of the problems with the gameplay as well. Also, you've probably noticed by now, but emulating the game gave me some visual bugs that I don't think are in the original. Floor textures don't want to load in properly sometimes, so you end up seeing through them. I couldn't find any solutions for this online, but at least it wasn't game-breaking or anything, so it's fine. One of the traps has the same issue, but it's easy enough to stay out of its way and not get hit by your own ceiling trap. Otherwise, the game runs fine emulated. The gameplay is fairly straightforward in Trapt. For the most part, the game functions a lot like Curator Deception 2, with some tweaks. So you have your 3 trap buttons to control the ceiling, wall, and floor traps, as well as a button to place new traps and swap them out as you see fit. There's room-specific traps again too, and about as high a frequency as they were in Deception 3, though I found them harder to use organically than in that game. A few of them I just couldn't figure out how the game wanted me to get people into them, and even when I did, the result often wasn't as interesting or as impactful as it was in Deception 3. A good example of this is the water mill, which bounces enemies off of it after dealing some damage. While in Deception 3 it nailed them to it and took them for a spin. Maybe it's the new way physics work in this game that caused a lot of the traps to feel less satisfying, since the game actually has them now. And I was about to say that is fairly impressive, but that was me thinking that this was an early PlayStation 2 game, because it really feels like one a lot of the time, and not something released in 2005, which it actually is. Probably the biggest improvement Trapt has unfortunately also becomes one of its biggest downfalls, especially if you want to focus on playing the campaign for this one. The game speed in general feels a lot faster. It's a proper dual analog game, and it's balanced for that. So enemies run faster, trap cooldowns are shorter, and their activation feels a lot snappier. And because it no longer has that weird PlayStation 1 era third-person control scheme, it's easier to walk around corners and check your surroundings. All of these changes basically mean that the general game flow has more than doubled compared to the past 2 games, and it feels really good to play because of that. Here's the problem though. In the campaign, the general ratio between gameplay and cutscenes has remained the exact same as it was in the PlayStation 1. The previous Deception titles were all paced pretty evenly, so with the game speed feeling 4 times as fast as before and the cutscenes remaining the same, you can expect to clear missions within a minute or 2 playing normally, while the intro and outro cutscenes take a lot longer than this. To make the discrepancy even more obvious, your save file only tracks your active playtime, not the cutscenes. Recording for video, I could see exactly how long I'd been playing, so I was about 4 hours into recording this game when my save file finally hit its first hour of game time. And that was while I was doing as many of the side missions as the game lets you. Also, about an hour in on my save file was when I was reaching the final 2 missions, so the game is exceptionally short and barely allows you to play it. With the story already not as interesting as it was in Kagero, you can imagine how much of a slog it becomes when you become aware of how little the game actually allows you to play it. But that's not the only pacing issue here either. Most story setups, the combat phase doesn't really fit the ending of the last cutscene. Often after a peaceful conversation, a few footsteps appear menacingly in the foreground before you go into the gameplay scene. Then, after killing the people there, the next cutscene acts like this gameplay section never happened. The cutscenes at the end of chapters usually try to end on cliffhangers, which then get resolved before the combat scene of the next chapter. So the entire flow feels uneven and weirdly balanced. Past games would usually have 1 combat scene per chapter, but Trapt instead gives you 2 combat scenes back to back before going back to your proper preparation screen, which feels a bit odd in terms of pacing. Especially since it's not consistent about it, but also because you're not allowed to prepare ahead of time in what is trying to present itself as an action strategy game. It's a weird design choice. And when I said that the flow is uneven with the placing of cliffhangers at the end of chapters, on your preparation screen between chapters you're allowed to play bonus missions, which I guess take place in another dimension entirely since they're completely unrelated to anything happening with the cliffhanger that continues uninterrupted when you resume the main story. Despite there only being 1 bonus mission per chapter and the access to individual ones is specifically tied to them. It's a clusterfuck. The worst thing regarding the pacing though, is the missions where a regular game would position a boss fight. Kagero had a few of those as well, basically putting you against stronger normal enemies with a larger amount of immunities towards traps than regular enemies, with more aggressive AI than the typical ones. Trapt, however, traps you in a single room with a higher number of enemies than usual. In my playthrough, these were the only missions to go longer than 2 minutes, which makes being stuck in a single room with not much going on in there even less fun to deal with. It wouldn't be unfair to say that a quarter of my time playing the campaign was inside these small rooms, while the 1 to 2 minute stages would give me a larger playing field to mess around with, which is another strange problem that Trapt has. You don't get access to the full maps at the start of the game. Instead, several of the more interesting rooms are locked with keys that you have to buy in the preparation screen. Playing normally, you'll likely have just about enough to unlock all of these and a handful of traps in a single playthrough, which means that if you do focus on unlocking these doors, you're not getting too many traps added to your pool. I get wanting to focus on New Game Plus, but that's a bit of an odd balancing decision. I guess they wanted to pace the areas you can explore over the course of the game, as there are only 2 maps that you can mess around with. But it's a really bad idea to lock areas this aggressively and give players a choice between new areas or new weapons in a way that prohibits experimentation with both. Of course, with the focus on New Game Plus, just like the older titles, you want to at least give people the feeling of having a full experience after clearing a single path, which you don't really get from playing the campaign with how short the missions are and how prohibitive the unlocking systems are. Also, because there's 2 maps, that also means that a good number of those keys you're buying are likely not going to be used immediately depending on the next stage of the game, since the keys open up individual rooms, not one room per location. It makes buying keys feel a lot less rewarding a lot of the time. And with how short the stages are, you don't really have the time to experiment with traps and rooms in the campaign either. Traps themselves have gone back to unlocking the way that they did in Kagero Deception 2, so no more crafting with modifiers to make a larger pool of individualized traps for yourself anymore. You're stuck with what the game gives you, and most of it is pretty mundane compared to what Deception 3 gave you to work with. I wouldn't call the selection bad, but it is a bit disappointing after the 3rd game went nuts with its selection and this game reins it back in again. All of this is very unfortunate because when the game does let you play, the gameplay feels a lot better than the last 2 Deception games. The higher game speed and the proper dual analog controls go a really long way to make it easier to pick up and play. One of the few modes where this is immediately apparent, along with the extent to which Trapt sabotages itself, is the optional survival mode outside of the campaign. Survival is the closest you'll get to uninterrupted gameplay, giving you one opportunity to select your traps before you go in, and from that point you're locked into continuous gameplay, with no cutscenes or menus in between. The traps that you selected at the start are what you're stuck with for the rest of the session, so a good selection goes a very long way. The downside is the format that survival takes. When I started playing, I expected to be allowed to roam freely between the maps of the game, giving a proper reason for the areas to be sealed off with keys in the campaign, as that mode had been too short to actually feel like I had the time to actually explore those rooms. But no. Survival locks you into a single room with 10 enemies, appearing in groups of 2. When you've killed all 10 enemies, you're loaded into the next room to face the next 10 enemies. Every time you move to a new room, your health replenishes. 10 enemies is a lot, and a good number of room traps are single use. Previous Deception games gave you a bigger playing field for a smaller pool of enemies, and you'd actually feel pressured to use it. You're also timed, and since placing new traps resets cooldowns on them, it almost feels like you're being pressured to loop enemies in a circle over a small set of traps that you've got in a corner of the room, since that is what is most efficient in a lot of cases. I can understand wanting to play into the theme of feeling trapped with a name like Trapt, but it's not really an undercurrent in the story either, just a limitation in the design of the game, which is odd because you think a next generation title would be the game to break free of restrictions like this from the past generation, but instead a lot of the freedom of the PlayStation 1 titles has been traded in favor of... I'm not sure what exactly. Faster gameplay that's hampered by a restrictive gameplay loop? There is a new feature in this game, but it's fairly hard to pull off a lot of the time, at least in my experience. Dark illusion traps. They're kind of just a room trap that plays a special animation when they hit someone, usually killing them instantly. As it stands, I found Trapt to be a confused entry in the series. It tries to ramp up some of the violence and go kind of cartoony at times, but at the same time still wants to have the tone and mood of the past two games. It ends up missing the mark on both goals, largely because it doesn't want to commit to anything. Something that's also shown in the confused naming of the game reflected between the original and Western titles. The gameplay got some nice improvements, but at times it feels like the game is just reluctant to let you experience that aspect, focusing more on a phoned-in story instead. If you've played the other games in the series and are desperate for more, it's worth experiencing it, because it doesn't take up much of your time at all. The campaign itself takes even less time to get through than Deception 3's campaign, but on its own merits, I cannot recommend Trapt as a first entry, and if you're not too deep into Deception as is, it's safe to skip it. I didn't hate the game, but it did leave me cold. As you're probably used to hearing by now, Trapt did end up getting represented in Dead or Alive 5, just the same as the other Deception titles. It feels a bit more fitting with this game though, since it's starting to feel more like a game made by Tecmo, for all intents and purposes. Anyway, this was AboveUp, and yeah, this game was a bit of a disappointment. I kinda wish that it focused on at least one thing. Like, if they went full gamey and cartoony, that would have been a thing. But it wants to have it both ways, and that's just kinda sad. As always, this video has been brought to you by people who are supporting me on Patreon. If you would like to become one of the names that you see scrolling on the screen, you can head over to patreon.com/AboveUp, and I will, see ya.